Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Veil Between Worlds. Holly Arnold had always been sensitive to the other side. From a young age she could sense things others could not, cold whispers in empty rooms, the smell of lilacs when the flowers had long since withered, and the shadows that moved just out of sight. It was a gift her grandmother had said passed down through the generations of their family. But to Holly it often felt more like a curse. After her grandmother passed away, Holly was left with an old Victorian house on the Isle of Wight. The house had been in the family for over a century, and it was rumoured to have been the site of many seances during the spiritualism craze of the late 1800s. The locals whispered about the place, calling it haunted, but Holly felt drawn to it. It was her legacy, after all, and something about the house called to her. The house was nestled in a secluded area, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to close in around it. Holly's first few days there were uneventful, as she unpacked boxes and tried to make the creaky old house feel like a home. But it wasn't long before she began to feel the presence of something else. It started with small things, a door creaking open on its own, the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Holly dismissed these occurrences as the quirks of an old house settling. But then came the dreams. Every night Holly would dream of the same room, a dark, windowless chamber with thick velvet curtains and a round table in the centre. Around the table sat faceless figures, their hands joined as they chanted in low, droning voices. In the centre of the table was a candle, its flame flickering wildly as though caught in a fierce wind, though the air in the room was still. Each night the dream grew more vivid, more real, until Holly could feel the heat of the candle's flame on her face, hear the murmurs of the figures' voices in her ears. It wasn't long before she realized that the room in her dreams was the very same seance room in her house, a room she had yet to enter. Compelled by a force she couldn't understand, Holly searched the house until she found it. The seance room was hidden behind a false wall in the attic, its entrance concealed by layers of dust and cobwebs. As she stepped inside, the air grew thick and heavy, like wading through water. The room was exactly as she had seen it in her dreams, dark, with heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly shut, a round table in the centre, and a single candle sitting in a tarnished brass holder. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, the echoes of countless seances conducted in this very room. The air buzzed with energy, the veil between walls thinner here than anywhere else in the house. Holly knew she had to be careful. She had heard stories of mediums who had opened doors they couldn't close, who had let things into the world that should never have been let in. But she was also curious. She had been drawn to this house for a reason, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her grandmother had left her something important, something she was meant to discover. Holly spent the next few days preparing. She gathered the tools she would need: a set of candles, a bowl of salt, a pendulum, and her grandmother's old spirit board. The board was worn and faded, the letters barely visible, but it still held power. Holly could feel it humming beneath her fingers as she traced the letters, a connection to the other side. On the night of the seance, the house was silent. Holly closed herself in the seance room, lighting the candles and drawing a circle of salt around the table. She placed the spirit board in the center and sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the planchette. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing her mind on the task at hand. "Is there anyone here with me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. At first there was nothing. The room was silent, the air still. But then the planchette began to move, slowly at first, then faster, until it was darting across the board. Holly watched in awe as it spelled out the words, *, we are here. *, a chill ran down her spine, but she pressed on. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, spelling out a name she didn't recognize. She asked more questions, learning that the spirits who lingered in a house were those who had been summoned here long ago, during the seances conducted by her ancestors. They were restless, trapped between worlds, unable to move on. Holly felt a pang of sympathy for them. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" The planchette stilled for a moment, as if the spirits were considering her offer. Then it moved again, spelling out a single word, *, portal. *, Holly frowned. What portal? The planchette didn't move, but the air in the room grew colder, the shadows deeper. Holly felt a strange sensation in her chest, like a tugging, as though something were pulling her towards the far corner of the room. She stood, moving towards the spot where the feeling was strongest. There, hidden beneath the floorboards, she found it a small, iron-bound trapdoor, the wood warped and ancient. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading down into the earth. A sickly sweet smell wafted up from the depths, and Holly gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. But something compelled her to go further. She grabbed a candle and, with a deep breath, descended the stairs. The passageway was narrow, the walls closing in around her as she made her way deeper into the earth. The air was thick and humid, the smell growing stronger with each step. Holly's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving, driven by a force she couldn't understand. Finally, she reached the bottom, stepping into a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with old, crumbling stones, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror. The glass was cracked and fogged, but Holly could see something moving within it, shadows shifting and swelling, as though the mirror held a world of its own. She approached the mirror cautiously, her candle casting flickering shadows on the walls. As she got closer, she could see that the mirror was not reflecting the chamber she stood in, but another place entirely, a dark, twisted landscape of barren trees and jagged rocks, shrouded in mist. And in the distance, barely visible, were figures pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths open in silent screams. Holly's blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing. This was the other side of the world of the dead. The spirits who had spoken to her through the board were trapped in this place, unable to move on, unable to escape. But the mirror was not just a window into that world, it was a portal. A way for the dead to cross over into the world of the living. And as Holly stared into the glass, she saw the figures in the distance begin to move, slowly making their way towards her. Panic seized her, and she turned to flee, but the passageway behind her had vanished, the walls closing in around her. She was trapped, alone in the dark with the mirror and the things that lurked beyond it. She tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, pulling her towards the mirror, towards the figures that were getting closer and closer. Holly struggled, but it was no use. The mirror's pull was too strong. As the first of the figures reached the glass, its hand pressed against the surface. For a moment, it was just a pale, ghostly image, but then the hand pushed through the glass, reaching out towards Holly. She screamed, but no sound came out. The hand was cold and clammy, its grip like iron as it wrapped around her wrist. More hands followed, reaching out of the mirror, grabbing at her arms, her legs, pulling her closer, pulling her into the glass. Holly thrashed and fought, but the more she struggled, the tighter their grip became. She was inches from the mirror now, her reflection twisted and distorted in the cracked glass. The figures were all around her, their empty eyes staring into hers, their mouths stretched wide in grotesque grins. Holly felt the cold glass against her face, and then she was pulled through, her scream swallowed by the darkness on the other side. The mirror shimmered for a moment, then stilled, its surface reflecting nothing but the empty chamber. The candle flickered and went out, leaving the room in darkness. And in the silence that followed, the trapdoor creaked shut, sealing itself once more. Holly Arnold was never seen again. The house on the Isle of Wight was abandoned, left to rot and decay. But on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind howls through the trees, some say you can still hear her screams, echoing from somewhere deep within the earth, a warning to those who might be tempted to follow in her footsteps. For the veil between worlds is thin, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The house stood as a silent sentinel, watching as time moved forward and the world changed around it. Townsfolk on the Isle of Wight spoke of the house in hushed tones, passing down the story of Holly Arnold to each new generation. But as the years wore on, the tale faded into the realm of legend, a ghost story told around campfires, its edges softened by time. The house, however, did not forget. Decades passed, and the old Victorian manor began to crumble. The forest encroached upon it, nature reclaiming what had once been man's domain. Ivy climbed its walls, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. Yet the seance room remained untouched, preserved as if frozen in time, waiting for someone to rediscover its secrets. That someone came in the form of a man named Thomas Harper, a historian with a fascination for the occult. Thomas had spent his life researching haunted locations, driven by a desire to uncover the truth behind the stories. When he stumbled upon the legend of Holly Arnold, he knew he had to visit the Isle of Wight. Thomas was not easily spooked. He had been to some of the most haunted places in the world, and though he had encountered strange phenomena, he had never found anything he couldn't explain away. But something about the story of Holly Arnold intrigued him. A medium who had vanished without a trace. A hidden seance room. A portal to another world. It was a perfect mystery. He arrived on the Isle of Wight in the middle of winter, when the island was at its most desolate. The locals were wary of him, as they always were of outsiders who showed an interest in the old house. But Thomas was persistent, and after a few days of asking questions, he found someone willing to take him to the house. The man who led him there was old and stooped, his face lined with age. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was low and filled with unease. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you. Bad things happen to those who do. That's what I'm here to find out." He left Thomas at the edge of the property, refusing to go any closer. As Thomas watched him disappear down the path, he felt a twinge of apprehension. But he pushed it aside. He had come too far to turn back now. The house loomed before him, a dark silhouette against the grey sky. It was more decrepit than he had imagined, its windows broken and its door hanging off its hinges. But it was still standing, and that was all that mattered. Thomas pushed open the door, the wood groaning in protest. The interior was cold and musty, the air thick with dust. He could see the remnants of the house's former grandeur in the faded wallpaper and the ornate mouldings, but it was clear that the place had been abandoned for a long time. He spent the day exploring, taking photographs and making notes. The house was as eerie as he had hoped, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. By the time the sun began to set, Thomas was beginning to wonder if the legend was nothing more than that, a legend. But then he found the seance room. It was almost exactly as Holly had left it, though the dust and cobwebs had settled thickly over everything. The table was still there, the candle holder still in the center, its brass tarnished with age. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the last light of the day. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine as he stepped into the room. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something waiting, just out of sight. He pulled out his camera and began to document the room, but as he did, he felt a strange pull, like he was being drawn towards the far corner. He set his camera down and followed the feeling, his steps slow and deliberate. It led him to a section of the floor where the boards were slightly raised. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the edges until he found the trapdoor. His heart pounded as he pried it open, revealing the narrow passageway leading down into the earth. The air that wafted up from below was rank and stale, and Thomas hesitated for a moment, the old man's warning echoing in his mind. But curiosity won out, and he descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The passageway was tight, the walls pressing in on him as he moved deeper into the earth. He could feel the weight of the house above him, the oppressive silence amplifying the sound of his own breathing. Finally, he reached the bottom, stepping into the circular chamber. His flashlight beam swept over the stone walls, and there, in the center of the room, stood the mirror. Thomas approached it cautiously, his heart racing. The glass was cracked and fogged, just as Holly had seen it, but there was something else, something moving within the glass. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging up the surface, and saw them shadows shifting, shapes barely discernible, but unmistakably there. He felt a pull, a compulsion to touch the glass, to reach out and connect with whatever was on the other side. But he hesitated, a flicker of fear taking root in his mind. He remembered Holly's story, how she had been drawn into the mirror, how she had vanished without a trace. But Thomas had always been a skeptic, always believed that every phenomenon had a logical explanation. He wasn't about to let fear get the better of him now. He reached out and touched the glass. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the room plunged into darkness. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving him alone in the pitch black. Panic surged through him, and he tried to pull his hand away, but he couldn't move. It was as if the glass had come alive, its surface rippling like water, drawing him in. A cold, clammy hand wrapped around his wrist, and Thomas gasped. He felt the pull, stronger now, as if something on the other side was trying to drag him through the mirror. He struggled, but it was no use. The hand's grip tightened, and he felt himself being pulled closer and closer to the glass. And then he saw them faces in the darkness, pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were the spirits, the ones who had been trapped on the other side for so long, reaching out for him, desperate to escape their prison. But as he was pulled towards the mirror, Thomas realized with dawning horror that they weren't trying to escape, they were trying to take him with them. With a surge of adrenaline, Thomas wrenched his hand free, stumbling back from the mirror. The darkness in the room seemed to recede, the figures fading back into the glass. His flashlight flickered back to life, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. Breathing heavily, Thomas backed away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come close, too close to being dragged into that other world. The stories were true. The portal was real. And it was still open. He knew he had to get out of there, had to leave the house and never return. But as he turned to leave, the trapdoor slammed shut, the sound echoing through the chamber like a death knell. Thomas ran to the door, pounding on it, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped, just like Holly had been, with no way out. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing, growing darker and more solid. He could feel them closing in on him, feel the cold breath of the spirits on his neck. In a desperate bid to escape, Thomas turned back to the mirror, his only hope now to reverse what had been done, to close the portal once and for all. He approached it cautiously, the shadows pressing in on him, whispering his name, promising release. With trembling hands, he touched the glass once more. This time, he didn't feel the pull. Instead, he felt something pushing back, something resisting his touch. He pressed harder, willing the portal to close, but the resistance grew stronger. The shadows began to coalesce, forming shapes, bodies, figures that stepped out from the darkness, their faces twisted and grotesque. They were no longer just spirits, they were something more, something worse, fueled by the hatred and despair that had festered in this place for so long. Thomas tried to pull his hand away, but the glass held him fast. The figures drew closer, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, hear their whispered taunts in his ears. And then, as if in response to his growing terror, the mirror's surface began to ripple. The figures recoiled, hissing as the glass seemed to push them back, drawing them in. Thomas watched in awe as the mirror's surface shimmered, the shadows being sucked into its depths. But the pull was too strong. As the last of the shadows was drawn into the mirror, Thomas felt himself being dragged along with them. He tried to resist, but it was no use. The mirror had become a vortex, pulling him towards it, towards the darkness that waited beyond. With a final, desperate scream, Thomas was pulled through the glass, the world around him vanishing in a swell of shadows and light. The mirror's surface rippled once, then stilled, its glass cracked and fogged, reflecting nothing but the empty chamber. The house was silent once more, the seance room bathed in darkness. The trapdoor *** continued, *** creaked open slowly, revealing the narrow passageway leading back up to the house. But there was no one left to climb the stairs, no one left to tell the tale. Days turned into weeks, and the Isle of Wight once again fell into its quiet routine. The old house stood, as it always had, a forgotten relic hidden among the trees. The locals, unaware of Thomas Harper's fate, eventually stopped talking about the strange man who had come asking questions. Life moved on, as it always does. But the house, the seance room, and the mirror, they waited. Months passed before the house would see another visitor. This time, it was a group of urban explorers, thrill-seekers drawn to the legend of the haunted house. They had heard rumors of the place, of the strange disappearances, and they were eager to capture footage of the supernatural. The group arrived late in the evening, the sun dipping below the horizon as they approached the house. It loomed before them, its windows like empty eyes staring down at them. They hesitated for a moment, exchanging nervous glances, but their curiosity got the better of them. The front door, though warped and weathered, gave way with a push, groaning as it swung open. The explorers stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house was exactly as they had imagined it, dusty, decaying, and filled with an eerie silence that seemed to press down on them from all sides. They split up, each taking a different part of the house, their cameras recording every step. The old staircases creaked under their weight, the floorboards groaned, and the wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls. The atmosphere was perfect, everything they had hoped for. But as they explored, the house began to close in around them. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of their vision, strange sounds echoed through the hallways, and the temperature dropped suddenly, chilling them to the bone. One of the explorers, a young woman named Rachel, found herself drawn to the attic. She had heard about the seance room, about the legends of the portal and the missing people, and she wanted to see it for herself. Her heart raced with excitement and fear as she climbed the narrow stairs, the others' voices fading into the distance behind her. The attic was dark and cold, the air thick with dust. Rachel's flashlight flickered as she swept it across the room, revealing the remnants of old furniture and forgotten belongings. And then she saw the hidden door, slightly ajar, leading into the seance room. She hesitated, a chill running down her spine. But curiosity pushed her forward. She slipped through the door, her flashlight illuminating the small, circular chamber beyond. The room was just as she had imagined it, dark, with heavy curtains drawn tightly shut, the round table in the center, and the mirror standing silently in the corner. Rachel felt the weight of the room's history pressing down on her, the air thick with the energy of all the seances that had taken place here. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the mirror, its surface cracked and fogged, reflecting her distorted image back at her. She reached out to touch the glass, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold surface. The moment she made contact, a wave of nausea swept over her, and she staggered back, her head spinning. The mirror rippled, its surface shifting like water, and for a moment she saw something dark shapes moving within the glass, their hollow eyes staring out at her. Rachel stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to call out to her friends, but her voice caught in her throat. She turned to leave the room, to get as far away from the mirror as possible, but the door had closed behind her, sealing her inside. Panic gripped her as she pounded on the door, desperate to escape. But the room remained silent, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The shadows around her deepened, the darkness closing in, suffocating her. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with their eerie, disembodied voices. Rachel turned back to the mirror, her eyes white with terror as she saw the figures in the glass moving closer, their forms becoming more defined, more solid. She backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the figures reached the surface of the glass, their hands pressing against it, pushing through. She watched in horror as they began to emerge, their twisted, gaunt bodies stepping out of the mirror and into the room. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The figures moved towards her, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. She could feel their cold breath on her skin, their hands reaching for her, pulling her closer. In a last, desperate effort, Rachel tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her down, suffocating her. The last thing she saw was the mirror, its surface shimmering as the figures dragged her into its depths. The seance room was silent once more, the mirror's surface still and lifeless. The trapdoor creaked open, the passageway leading back to the house waiting for its next victim. The explorers searched for Rachel, but they found no trace of her. The others eventually fled the house, their footage abandoned in the chaos of their escape. They never spoke of what happened there, too terrified to recount the horrors they had witnessed. The house on the Isle of Wight stands empty to this day, a place where time has no meaning and the veil between worlds is perilously thin. The legends have only grown stronger, the stories of the missing echoing through the generations, warning those who would dare to uncover its secrets. But the house waits, as it always has, patient and unyielding, for the next curious soul to cross its threshold. And when they do, it will be ready, its dark secrets hidden behind the cracked glass of the mirror, waiting for the moment when the veil will lift once more and the horrors on the other side will reach out and claim another victim. For in that house, on that cursed island, the veil between worlds is not just thin, it is torn, and what lies beyond it is always hungry. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.